Assalamu alaikum. Welcome for social studies class. We have new lesson this week, and this is Kingdoms and Trading States of Africa. This is your part 3, lesson number 5, and this is the first class of this lesson. You can find this lesson into your textbook page number 34 and 35. Lesson objective is that students must be able to know that how powerful West African kingdoms controlled the rich Saharan trade routes and how the Indian Ocean trade routes led to the growth of wealthy city-states along the East African coast. In short, you must be able to know that how trade played a great role in shaping up the West African kingdoms as well as the trade routes. Starting with today's lesson, we should start with Africa's introduction. You must know that Africa is a continent that has one of the oldest recorded history. It is home to the old civilizations. It has a diverse cultures. There are diverse communities that are living in the continent, and Africa is a continent that has been least explored by the outside nations due to its varied topographical and geographical conditions. There were traders and merchants that came to the continent, but they remained on the continental edge. And even the invaders, the occupying forces, they did not try for a long time to go deep into the Africa's interior. So that's why African communities they emerged or they developed for a long time in isolation, and their cultural beliefs, their social beliefs, their traditions and customs, they had their own distinct presentation which are different from the other parts of the world. Although there are so much adaptations, because once the communities they merged together, once the trade took place, or once the trade expanded, the people of Africa also adopted from the other nations. But still Africa's culture overall, they are still very much original. There are very few adaptations from the other, and you can see that Africa's cultures even today they are very much distinct from the other cultures of the world. So that's the introduction of the Africa. Let's start how different nations emerged, how they rose and how they decline. Our journey starts with that how with the major question that how the Africa's cultural unification took place, and how different cultures merged together, how the different cultures they adopted from each other. You must know that human migrations they have always contributed quite a lot in bringing adaptations from other cultures to a culture of one community. So in Africa, human migrations took for long times. They are known as Bantu migrations, and due to this series of Bantu migration, the African languages of today, one third of the African languages they have their roots into the Bantu family of languages. In the continent of Africa, the civilizations that emerged, for example, to the north or northeast, it was Egyptian civilization that emerged along the Nile River. To the south of Egypt, it was Nubia, or you can say Kush, which is modern day Sudan, that emerged and developed and grew as a power for a long time. They ruled the region as a great power, but they had been in a conflicting relationship with Egyptians. For time and again, Egyptians they invaded Nubia. They took control of their territories, but every time the Egyptians they came as an invaders, for some time they remained there, and eventually they were kicked back. Finally, the capital of Nubia was shifted around 500 BC to another place called Meroe, which became an important trading center, and it became the point where the ironwork was performed, weapons were produced, tools were produced made of iron. But eventually, Nubians were finally defeated by another emerging power called Axum, which is modern day Ethiopia. Ethiopia, they took over Exum around 350 BC. Uh, so that was the decline of the Kush or Nubia, and Egypt remained in the northern part, and Egypt itself became under the influence of Romans and the Greeks from the north. They invaded the area. They Christianized the country, or they Christianized the region, you can say. So because Egypt was geographically on the crossroads of east and west, of north and south, every nation that was attempting to make trade with other nations, they crossed through Egypt. So Egypt was a place where where so many cultures they got mixed up, and this region saw that once Islam took over the Egyptian society, all the other religions, they were gone into the background. Not only Islam came dominant in the Egypt, but also it spread in the northern Africa and eventually into the West Africa. So this is the north part of the continent. Moving on to the west part of the continent, let's go on to the next slide. From the map, you can see that how the trade routes were working here in the West African continent through the Sahara and the savannas. The important trading centers like Timbuktu, like Fez, like Tripoli, they were the main points where the different communities they interacted to each other, and they managed to adopt and to learn from each other. So North Africa eventually became Muslim once Egypt became Muslim. Ultimately, Islam spread to the other parts of the continent. Cities they benefited from the trade that was being done with Egypt, being done with Arabia through Egypt, and the important trading items were like grain, like wine and gold and ivory. Although Islam actually did not supported the trade of wine, but other communities like the European Christians, they were selling the wine for Africa's minerals. Similarly, the arrival of camels into Africa made it easy for the trade to improve, and they were the best source of transportation into the desert, particularly the Sahara. They were used for transporting the important trade items, like the most important trade items in the West Africa was the salt, which was even sometimes exchanged with the gold. So this is how the trade improved in the West African continent. We are on the next slide, we are going to discuss that what were the important kingdoms that emerged into the West Africa. So the first nation that emerged dominant and strong in West Africa was Soninke people. They emerged from the farming communities of the West Africa. They formed the kingdom of Ghana, and they had plenty of gold abundance in production, but the thing that they lacked was salt, even to such an extent that they exchanged gold for the sake of salt, because salt was one of their basic need, and they had zero production. Ultimately they had to purchase salt for by selling gold, by exchanging gold. So when Arab merchants reached there, when they saw this situation, they started to call Ghana as a land of gold. When Ghana declined, another important kingdom emerged, and that was known as the Kingdom of Mali. Mali actually started to take control over the trade routes of West Africa, particularly the salt and gold trade, and they dominated for a long time. In the meantime, Mansa Musa built the empire, or built the kingdom on strong footings. The arrival of Islam allowed Mansa Musa to develop the links with the Arab world, and this uh, in the contrary, or this in the other end, helped Islam to spread in West Africa very easily, because now they had the support of the local government there. In this way, Mali improved its relationship with Arab world, as well as in the local regions. Mali had
a strong influence. Once the Mali declined, another important kingdom that emerged was the Kingdom of Songhai. Kingdom of Songhai actually was one of the biggest kingdom that existed in West Africa at that time, and ultimately the Kingdom of Songhai started to decline once the Europeans they started to infiltrate in West Africa in the name of trade, and ultimately a long slave trade started to take place. The slaves were purchased from West Africa and they were sent into America. Ultimately, many small kingdoms they were wiped out because the larger kingdoms they grabbed or they took these people as slaves in the smaller kingdoms and they sold them to the European merchants. So many of the smaller kingdoms they actually vanished from the map of the West Africa. But ultimately Songhai they remained dominant for a long time, but their decline came when the Europeans came into the region. So this was the story of the states of the West Africa. I hope it will help you to understand the topic. We will come back into the next week with the remaining portion of the lesson, the trading routes of the East Africa and some of the important states that emerged in the eastern coast of the Africa. See you next time. Inshallah, we'll meet again.